The desert sky of New Mexico burned gold at dusk, streaked with thin ribbons of cloud that glowed like molten silver. Inside a small twin-engine plane, a man in his 60s adjusted the throttle with hands that once guided fighter jets through storm and fire. His name was Jack Henderson, and tonight he carried something far more fragile than steel. In the insulated crate beside him, a heartbeat flickered, a Mexican wolf pup barely 2 weeks old, weak from the struggle of its first days. Its breath came shallow, then steady, as Jack murmured softly, "Easy there, little one. You're not alone." Outside, lightning stitched across the horizon. The radio hissed. Turbulence lifted the plane like a leaf in a storm. Jack's voice trembled through the headset. "Control, this is Flight Safe 27, copy, only static." The world shrank to one cabin light and a pulse beneath a thin blanket. As rain drummed against the wings, Jack remembered the briefing that morning. USFWS Safe Program 2024. 27 wolf pups flown to wild dens across the Southwest to rebuild the future of a species once thought lost. But numbers on paper don't cry, don't shiver, don't cling to life between thunderclaps. This pup did. The smell of fuel and the faint cry of the tiny wolf filled the cockpit. Jack steadied the controls, his old instincts waking. "You've got more fight in you than half the pilots I knew," he whispered with a grin. A bolt of lightning tore the dark open. For a moment, the cockpit lit like daylight, revealing the outline of the crate, the wolf's small body moving weakly, and Jack's eyes glistening with something he hadn't felt in years, hope. They said this was just another delivery. But I knew from the first breath I heard, this flight wasn't carrying cargo. It was carrying a heartbeat. What happened next would surprise everyone who ever believed a wild creature could forget the sound of kindness. Before the rescue flight that would change his life, Jack Henderson lived quietly on the edge of Santa Fe, New Mexico. His hangar sat at the end of a cracked airstrip where mesquite bushes pushed through the asphalt and coyotes howled from the dry hills at night. Inside that hangar, beneath a dust-covered flag from his Air Force days, rested a faded twin-engine plane he called Coyote Wing. Jack had flown missions decades earlier, search and rescue over wildfires, medevac runs through mountain fog. After retiring, he lost his wife Marlene to cancer. Since then, the sky had become both his solitude and his prayer. He spent mornings polishing the propeller blades, evenings listening to distant howls that reminded him of the wolves he'd once seen in Yellowstone on a rare vacation. He'd always admired how they moved not as beasts of fear, but as families loyal, disciplined, unbroken. When the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service launched its 2024 initiative to reintroduce Mexican wolves into the wild under the SAFE program, Saving Animals. From extinction, Jack saw a notice seeking volunteer pilots to help with genetic diversity flights. Most pilots saw risk. Jack saw redemption. After years of flying men into war, he said, "Once, maybe it was time I flew something home." He passed the physical, dusted off his license, and refitted Coyote Wing with insulated crates and oxygen monitors. The plane's belly could carry 4 pups, but he liked to take 1 or 2 less cargo, more care, he'd say. In the wild hills of Arizona's Sky Islands, wolf recovery wasn't just science. It was a patchwork of partnerships, biologists crawling through canyons to locate dens, tribal conservationists ensuring ancestral lands stayed safe, pilots ferrying newborns across state lines before their scent faded from the mother's memory. The rule was precise. Pups had to reach a den within 14 days of birth, or the wild mother would reject them. Timing was everything. Turbulence, weather, or delay could erase months of planning. That spring, the mountains were alive with bloom. Rain had come early, painting the desert in wildflowers, but it also meant unpredictable storms, a challenge for small planes. Jack studied weather charts the way others studied scripture. He'd circle the words, "wind shear risk," and whisper, "we'll find a way." His companion at the airfield was a red-tailed hawk that nested on the hangar roof. He named her Scout. Sometimes she'd glide alongside his plane as he taxied down the runway as if saluting an old soldier heading back to duty. "People think flying's about control," Jack said once to a young volunteer. "It's not. It's about listening to the wind, to the wings, and sometimes to something that doesn't speak at all." Each mission carried its own story. There was Pup 17, who yipped so loudly the whole flight, Pup 21, born blind in one eye, yet placed successfully with a wild pack near Alpine. But it was Pup 27, the smallest, quietest of all, that would test every lesson Jack had ever learned about courage, patience, and letting go. Before that call came, though, Jack had one ordinary morning left. He walked the runway, felt the wind shift east, and smiled. He didn't know that somewhere, hundreds of miles away, a wolf mother was giving birth, and destiny was already calling his name. He had spent a lifetime chasing horizons, but soon one fragile life would teach him that sometimes the most important flight is the one that returns us to our humanity. The call came just after dawn. Jack was refueling his plane when the radio on the workbench crackled. "Safe ops to flight. Coyote Wing, we have an emergency transfer request. Pup number 27, female, weak vitals. Mother relocated. Risk of loss is high. Can you fly within the hour?" Jack paused, the wind tugging at his jacket. He looked toward the mountains, their tips hidden in mist. "Send the coordinates," he said quietly. By the time the sun rose, the airfield shimmered with heat. A white pickup from the USFWS Wildlife Center pulled in carrying a small incubator. Inside lay a wolf pup barely the size of a man's hand, her fur gray-white, her chest rising in faint rhythm. A tag read, "Safe to 27. Female, born April 14, 2024. The biologist, Dr. Ramirez, met Jack at the hangar door. "She's not feeding well," he explained. "We've tried 3 dens, but the mothers already have too many pups. We're hoping the Sierra Madre pack will take her, but she needs to be airborne in 30 minutes. Jack nodded, his voice low. "Then, we'd better give her the smoothest ride of her life." It wasn't the first pup he'd flown, but something about this one made him hesitate. Her fur was thinner, her cry softer, almost uncertain, like she wasn't sure she belonged to this world yet. He remembered his daughter years ago, holding a kitten with the same trembling care. She used to say, "You have to believe for them until they can believe for themselves." Jack whispered to the pup, "All right, little one, I'll believe for you." The flight path crossed hundreds of miles of desert and forest. Beneath them stretched the canyons where the wild wolves roamed, places untouched by fences or roads. Jack flew low enough to see them, sometimes gray shadows moving through brush, reminders of what waited below. Halfway through the flight, turbulence hit. The plane shuddered violently, and Jack's coffee spilled across the console. A warning light flashed red, fuel pressure low. "Not now," he muttered. He tapped the gauge-adjusted valves and steadied the wings. But the noise startled the pup, her tiny body spasmed, breathing ragged. Jack's heart raced. He unclipped his harness, reached over the crate, and pressed 2 fingers to her chest. Come on, girl. Don't quit on me now." He remembered training decades earlier, pressure-breathing rhythm steady. The same rhythm he used now, tapping softly in time with her heartbeat. Slowly, she exhaled, then inhaled again. The beep from her monitor steadied. In that moment, 30,000 feet above the earth, something shifted. The mission wasn't about data or quotas anymore. It was about one life and one man's promise to deliver it home. When the storm cleared, they were both silent, 2 survivors in a fragile machine between heaven and wilderness. The pup slept soundly for the first time. Jack watched her chest rise and fall, his own breath sinking to hers. "Guess we're both a little lost," he said softly. "But the wild's waiting for you. You just don't know it yet." The radio finally came alive. "Coyote Wing, you're clear to descend. Ground crew waiting at Sierra Ridge." "Copy that," Jack replied. "Passengers in better shape than I am." Science would call it coincidence. Jack called it memory. Either way, it was the start of something he couldn't quite explain. He thought the mission ended on that runway, but fate had only just opened its wings. That night, the rain returned to the mountains. Jack had stayed near the small field station at Sierra Ridge just long enough to refuel file reports and rest his stiff hands. But sleep didn't come. He kept thinking about the pup. Normally, after a transfer, the handlers took over short flights, quick paperwork, no lingering. But something about Pup 27. The smallest in the batch had lodged itself in his chest. When he learned that her designated den was still inaccessible due to flash floods, Jack volunteered to hold her temporarily for an additional night of monitoring. The biologist hesitated, then nodded. One night, under supervision. Inside the hangar, the storm howled. Jack sat by the crate, a small heater humming. The pup curled in a soft towel. Her breathing was still uneven, each rise of her chest a battle. He placed his palm near her nose, feeling the fragile warmth of her breath. "She's got more courage in that tiny body than most men I've known," he whispered. He recorded vitals every hour, temperature, respiration, hydration. Between notes, he talked quietly, as if telling a bedtime story to a grandchild he'd never had. "You know, I used to fly people out of war zones," he said. "Never thought I'd be flying you into one that humans created by mistake." Outside, the world had forgotten her already. But inside that hangar, she was somebody's whole world. At dawn, he brought her out to the airfield wrapped in a towel. The storm had cleared, leaving the desert washed clean. Coyotes yipped in the distance, and somewhere far off, a wolf's distant howl answered. The pup lifted her head slightly, ears twitching. Jack smiled. "Hear that? That's where you belong." That morning was supposed to be simple, just a short flight toward the canyon range, where field biologists would meet him at a remote drop zone. But nature had other plans. A new weather front swept across the valley. Winds gusted hard, rattling the hangar doors. The radio buzzed Coyote Wing weather's unstable. Delay recommended. Jack checked the crate. The pup slept soundly, heartbeat steady. He keyed the mic. "Copy that. But I've flown through worse. Every pilot has that one moment when the sky decides to test you. This was his." He set the plane for a controlled descent, found a flat stretch near the canyon rim, barely wide enough for a landing. The tires hit the sand with a jolt, throwing dust into the air. The engine coughed to silence. Inside the cabin, it was quiet except for the rain tapping the metal roof. Jack exhaled shakily. "We made it. Somehow." He turned toward the crate. The pup was awake now, her eyes still cloudy blue, meeting his for the first time. It wasn't the look of an animal afraid, he said later. It was trust, raw and undeserved. He opened the crate, letting her sniff the air. She blinked, sneezed, and stretched her tiny paw across his sleeve. For a second, Jack forgot the years, the medals, the loneliness, everything but that fragile connection. He wrapped her against his jacket, stepping out into the light drizzle. The air smelled of pine and rain-soaked earth. Mountains rose around them, silent witnesses to a small miracle. He didn't say it out loud, but part of him wondered if wolves could feel gratitude, or if it was just his own heart filling in the silence. That night, as the field team prepped for the final leg of the journey, Jack stood outside beneath a canopy of stars. He thought of his wife, his daughter, the soldiers he'd once flown through fire, and now a single wolf pup whose heartbeat had reminded him what hope sounded like. He looked toward the mountains, whispering, "You're almost home, little one. Just hold on a little longer." He thought he was saving her life. He didn't know she was saving his. By sunrise, the clouds had broken, revealing a sky washed clean by storm. Jack stood beside the refueled coyote wing, running a calloused hand across its metal skin as if to thank it for surviving another night. The pup, small, alert, and curious, now watched him from her crate tail, twitching with new energy. Today was the day. The field crew had cleared a narrow route toward Blue Mesa, a stretch of high forest where a wild female had recently birthed a litter. If all went well, this tiny passenger would be placed into that den before dusk. If not, she'd lose the chance to ever belong. Jack double-checked the weather report, clear skies, light crosswinds, visibility, excellent. But experience told him the mountains rarely kept their promises. He adjusted the flight plan anyway, whispering to himself, "One last flight." The air was smooth at first. Below them, rivers gleamed like ribbons of glass. Elk moved through meadows in golden clusters. Jack tuned the radio to the operations channel, half listening as other pilots checked in. He hummed an old tune his wife loved, something gentle, almost prayer-like. Then came the static, a sharp buzz followed by a hiss. "Safe ops. This is Flight 27. Reading me silence." He switched frequencies. Nothing. The mountains were blocking the signal. Every pilot knows the quiet before trouble. It's the kind that presses behind your ribs, like the air itself is holding its breath. The engine coughed once. Then again. Fuel pressure, steady oil temperature, normal. Yet the left propeller vibrated. He tapped the gauge needle, jumped. "Easy now," he muttered, easing back the throttle. The plane jolted hard. The pup squealed. He could turn back. There was still time. But one glance at the crate, the fragile heartbeat depending on him, told him he wouldn't. Not yet. Jack trimmed the rudder and dove lower, skimming just above the canyon floor. Wind howled between the cliffs, slamming the wings from side to side. He'd flown combat missions before, but this felt different. Back then, he carried men trained for danger. Now, he carried innocence itself. A gust hit hard. The plane pitched left. Cargo straps groaned. The pup tumbled in the crate, crying. Jack's heart jumped. He reached across, steadying it with one hand while fighting the controls with the other. "Hang in there, girl. We're almost there." The storm closed around them, sudden and violent. Rain hammered the windshield. Visibility dropped to nothing but gray. He'd always believed flying was about courage. But that day, it was about faith, the kind that keeps your hands steady when reason says let go. The altimeter spun 9,000, 8,000, 7,500. Terrain alert screamed. Jack pulled back gently, praying under his breath. Then, through the mist, he saw it, the clearing marked with an orange tarp where the biologists waited. But the crosswinds were vicious. One wrong angle and he'd stall. He circled once, twice. "All right, little one," he whispered. "We're doing this together." He aligned with the wind, lowered flaps, and descended. The landing gear struck uneven ground. The plane bounced, skidded, and stopped just meters from a pine line. Silence fell. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the pup barked a small, high sound of life. Jack laughed, shaky, almost disbelieving. He'd carried wounded soldiers before, but this was different. There was no medal waiting at the end, only the sound of life returning to where it belonged. They reached a hollow beneath a fallen log. Inside, a wild mother wolf lifted her head, eyes amber wary. She sniffed the air, low growl rumbling. The biologist placed pup 27 at the entrance, retreating slowly. The small wolf crawled forward, whining softly. The mother froze, then sniffed her again once, twice, and to everyone's astonishment, pulled her close. In that quiet moment, science and instinct met halfway. A mother accepted a child that wasn't hers. A species gained another chance. Jack exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. His throat tightened. "She's home," he whispered. For the first time in years, he felt peace, not the kind that comes from stillness, but from purpose. Aaron, the young biologist, touched his shoulder. "You did good, Captain." Jack smiled faintly. "No, she did." They hiked back in silence. Overhead clouds broke apart, spilling gold across the treetops. He looked up and thought he saw a shape, a hawk circling high, wings wide. Maybe it was Scout, maybe just the wind. Either way, he saluted. He had spent a lifetime landing in war zones. But this was the first time he'd ever landed in hope. For a while, silence followed the storm. The rescue was complete, the pup accepted, and the report filed. Jack expected nothing more than a quiet flight home, but peace rarely lasts long in the wild or in bureaucracy. 2 days later, his phone buzzed. An official-sounding voice asked Mr. Henderson, "This is compliance review from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We'd like to discuss your last flight, Flight 27. Jack's stomach tightened. He'd known the protocol pilots transport only no unsupervised contact. He had spent extra hours with the pup during the storm. Necessary, yes, but technically outside procedure. On social media, photos of the storm landing spread quickly. Someone from the field crew had shared a clip Jack cradling the small wolf as the rain poured down. It went viral. Headlines read, "Veteran pilot saves endangered wolf pup in mid-air drama." Public loved it. Officials didn't. A week later, Jack was called to Albuquerque for a review meeting. He arrived in his worn flight jacket, carrying his logbook like a shield. Inside, 3 officials sat behind a polished table. One of them, a younger man with sharp eyes, spoke first. "Mr. Henderson, your record is exemplary, but you were not authorized to shelter the animal overnight. Do you confirm?" Jack nodded slowly. "Weather grounded me. She wouldn't have survived alone. I did what any pilot would have done." The man's expression didn't soften. Intent isn't the issue. Compliance is. Rules mattered. Jack knew that better than anyone. Rules kept missions safe, science, credible species protected. But sometimes rules couldn't see the storm from inside the cockpit. Dr. Ramirez entered mid-meeting, still in field uniform. "If he hadn't acted, we'd have lost the pup," he said firmly. "She's thriving now because of him." The room went quiet. After a pause, the senior officer sighed. "Fine, no suspension. But from now on, every action must be logged in real time. Safe protocols are not negotiable." Jack nodded again, relief mixing with fatigue. Within days, backlash grew louder. Ranchers claimed the wolves threatened cattle. Politicians called the reintroduction a federal overreach. Talk shows used Jack's viral photo as symbol, some praising, others mocking. He never wanted fame. He just wanted to fly. It was strange, he thought, how humans could turn compassion into controversy. One night, as the desert wind pushed through the hangar doors, he sat staring at the empty crate. A coyote cried in the distance, lonely, echoing. He whispered, "Guess they don't all get it, little one. But that's all right. We didn't do it for them." A week later, an envelope arrived. Inside was a single photograph, a shot from a wildlife camera deep in Blue Mesa, a young wolf standing beside her mother, ears perked, staring straight into the lens. On the back, a handwritten note, "Safe 27, confirmed alive and well." Signed, E. Ramirez. Jack's hands trembled as he held the picture. For the first time in months, he laughed a sound rough and joyful. He pinned the photo to the cockpit dashboard right beside the one of his wife. The world could argue all it wanted. The forest didn't care about politics. The wolves just lived. He learned that saving a life could start a debate. But sometimes doing the right thing isn't about being right, it's about being kind. By autumn, the heat of summer had faded into long golden evenings. The storms were gone, the skies calm again. Jack's plane sat silent in the hangar dust, gathering on its wings. He hadn't flown for weeks. After the review hearing and the flood of attention, the agency had offered him a choice: retire with honors or stay on as a mentor for new volunteer pilots. It was meant as a gesture of respect, but Jack felt something in him had already landed for the last time. He spent his mornings fixing minor parts on Coyote Wing, not because they were broken, but because keeping busy was easier than saying goodbye. He'd look at that picture and wonder how she was doing, if she'd grown into her paws, if she remembered the hum of the engine that once carried her across the storm. Sometimes at dusk, he thought he heard howls from the distant ridges. It was probably coyotes. Probably. But he still opened the hangar door and listened. Dr. Ramirez called occasionally with updates. "She's doing great, Jack. Integrated fully with the pack. Strong, female, bold, always the first to step forward when we track them." Jack smiled through the phone. "Yeah, that sounds like her." But even good news couldn't fill the silence that followed. Every story has a takeoff, but few prepare you for the landing. One crisp October morning, he drove back to Blue Mesa. He didn't tell anyone, just packed a thermos, his jacket, and the old flight cap Marlene had given him. The dirt road wound through forests of gold and rust, leaves scattered in the wind like confetti. When he reached the last ridge, he parked and walked the rest of the way. It's one thing to hear a wolf through a radio recording. It's another to feel the sound vibrate through your chest like the earth remembering something wild. He stood still, eyes wet, waiting. Then, at the tree line, movement, a gray figure emerging from the brush. Young, lean, with eyes of liquid amber. She stopped just 20 yards away. The wind shifted, carrying his scent. The wolf lifted her head, sniffed once, and didn't run. Jack whispered, "Hello, girl." The wolf tilted her head slightly, just as she'd done in the hangar months ago. Then she stepped forward, not close enough to touch, but close enough for him to see the faint scar near her paw, the same place the IV had been taped that night in the storm. For a heartbeat, it was as if time folded back on itself, the old pilot and the pup who had shared a sky. She stared at him, tail low, calm. Then she threw her head back and howled one long, echoing call that rolled down the valley. Another howl answered from deeper in the forest, then another. The pack. He'd flown her to freedom once. Now she'd returned the favor. Jack sat on a rock, looking out across the valley as sunlight broke through the clouds. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. Before heading back, he whispered something to the wind, not goodbye, but thank you. When he reached the car, he looked up one last time. On a ridge high above, a silhouette stood watching, still proud and wild. Then it turned and disappeared into the trees. He smiled. "Fly safe, little one. Some journeys end with a landing, others with a howl." Winter came to the desert that year like a whisper. Frost rimed the hangar windows, and the morning air tasted of iron and pine. Jack's days had settled into quiet rhythms again, coffee at dawn, tools lined in perfect order, and a chair facing east toward the rising sun. He didn't fly much anymore. Coyote Wing sat polished and waiting like a faithful friend, ready for orders that never came. But he still started the engine once a week, just to hear it purr, just to remember what it felt like when the sky answered back. The photo of Pup 27 still hung in the cockpit, her wild eyes staring out toward open sky. He'd given her a name in private, Luna. It felt fitting she was born under the April moon, and like the moon she had returned to remind him that wild things can still find their way home. One morning, he received a letter from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Inside was a printed report. Safe Initiative, 2024. 27 pups, fostered, 23, survived genetic diversity, increased by 18. Part at the bottom, handwritten in blue ink, "Thank you for carrying hope across the sky, E. Ramirez." Jack folded the letter carefully, slid it into the logbook, and smiled. He had never needed medals, but that line "carrying hope across the sky" felt like one. That same week, the agency invited him to a small ceremony at a wildlife refuge near Alpine, Arizona. A quiet event, no press, no speeches, just the people who had made the impossible possible. For Jack, it was the closest thing to applause he'd ever needed. He stayed after the others left, watching the moon rise above the tree line, a silver disk climbing into the blue-black sky. The wind shifted, carrying a faint scent of rain and something else, something wild. He thought he saw movement at the ridge's edge, too far to be certain, but just clear enough for his heart to believe. Maybe it was her, maybe not. The truth didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that she was out there alive, strong, free, and that somewhere between man and wilderness, trust had taken flight. Jack whispered softly, "Good night, Luna." The years might take his strength, but not that memory. The sound of a heartbeat that refused to quit. When people asked later why he kept volunteering long after retirement, he'd simply say, "Because the wild still needs wings." And maybe that's what the world needs too, not heroes, not saviors, just ordinary people willing to fly through storms for something they love. He had given the wild a second chance, and in return, the wild had given him something far rarer: peace. When you strip away the noise, the politics, the paperwork, the headlines, what remains is simple: one man, one wolf pup, and a sky wide enough for both. Jack Henderson never set out to be a hero. He was just a pilot who saw a fragile life and refused to look away. But through that act, through a storm, through fear, through silence, he became part of something far greater than himself, the healing of a wild world that still remembers kindness. The USFWS SAFE program taught us that conservation isn't just about numbers, it's about connection. Each pup carried by air wasn't only a genetic code, it was a heartbeat, a promise that extinction isn't the end, only a warning. It took science to plan those flights. It took courage to fly them. But it took compassion to make them mean something. And maybe that's the lesson Jack left behind, that humanity and wilderness don't have to stand on opposite sides of survival. They can share the same sky, the same breath, the same fragile hope. Because when people care enough to reach across the storm, when they fly for the voiceless, protect what can't protect itself, the world shifts just a little. Maybe the next child who hears Luna's story will dream of flying too. Not for fame, not for fear, but for faith in life, in balance, in the quiet bond that still ties us to the wild. When we choose compassion over comfort, duty over distance, we remind the wild and ourselves